As the snow blanketed the town in a silent shroud, the faint glimmer of Christmas lights attempted to pierce the darkness of a particularly cold December night. The festive cheer that usually filled the air was, for me, overshadowed by an eerie feeling, a prelude to a night that would forever be etched in my memory as a horrific Christmas tale. I was a college student then, back in my hometown for the holidays. The town, nestled in a remote part of the Midwest, was known for its tight-knit community and quaint Christmas traditions. That year, however, the holiday spirit was dampened by the mysterious disappearance of a local teenager just a week before Christmas. The town was on edge, whispers of foul play and old legends resurfacing with each passing day. On Christmas Eve, after a quiet dinner with my family, I decided to take a walk. The crisp winter air felt refreshing, and the almost deserted streets, lined with festive decorations, seemed like a scene from a Christmas card. But as I walked, an unsettling quietness enveloped me. The usual laughter and music from homes were replaced by a somber silence, as if the town itself was holding its breath. I found myself drawn to the old, abandoned church at the outskirts of the town. The church, a relic from a bygone era, stood desolate, its once magnificent structure now succumbing to the ravages of time. As I approached, a flickering light from within caught my attention. Curiosity overcame caution, and I pushed open the creaking door. Inside, the remnants of what once was a place of worship lay in decay. But it wasn't the dilapidated state of the church that sent a shiver down my spine. In the dim light of a single candle, I saw a figure huddled in a corner, whispering to himself. The figure was an old man, his eyes reflecting a mix of fear and madness. He looked up as I approached, his gaze piercing through the shadows. "You shouldn't be here," he rasped, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tonight, the veil is thin, and they walk among us." His words, though cryptic, filled me with an inexplicable dread. I asked him who he was talking about, but he just shook his head and pointed to a tattered book on the floor. The book, old and bound in leather, was filled with tales of the town's history and folklore. As I flipped through the pages, a story caught my eye, the legend of the Yule Cat, a monstrous creature said to roam the town every Christmas, preying on those who were alone and lost. The old man claimed the Yule Cat was more than just a legend. He spoke of strange sightings and unexplained disappearances over the years, always around Christmas. His words were frantic, his eyes darting around as if expecting the creature to emerge from the shadows. I wanted to dismiss his tales as the ramblings of a madman, but the recent disappearance in the town lingered in my mind. The old man begged me to leave, to find safety in numbers, for the Yule Cat was drawn to solitude. Reluctantly, I left the church, the old man's warnings echoing in my ears. As I hurried back towards the town, the wind picked up, howling through the trees like the cries of lost souls. The once familiar streets now seemed alien and menacing. Every shadow appeared to move, every sound made me jump. Then, in a deserted alley, I heard it, a low guttural growl, unlike any animal I knew. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. In the faint light of the street lamp, I saw a pair of glowing eyes, large and unblinking, staring at me from the darkness. The creature, if it was the Yule Cat, was massive, its fur matted and its claws scraping against the cobblestone. For a moment, we locked eyes, and in those eyes, I saw a primal hunger, a malevolence that was ancient and unfathomable. I ran like I had never before, not daring to look back. The growls faded into the distance, but the terror remained, gripping my heart in an icy clasp. I reached home, panting and trembling. My family, concerned by my state, asked what had happened, but I couldn't bring myself to tell them. How could I explain an encounter that defied logic, a horror that seemed ripped from the pages of folklore? That night, I lay awake, listening to the wind outside, wondering if the Yule Cat was still prowling the streets, searching for its next victim. The disappearance of the teenager remained unsolved, and the old man at the church was never seen again. Years have passed since that frightful Christmas Eve, but the memory remains vivid. I've often wondered if what I experienced was real or a figment of my imagination. But one thing is certain. Every Christmas, as the town revels in the festive spirit, I can't help but feel a sense of dread, a reminder of the night when I came face to face with a horror that lurked in the shadows of my quaint little town. It was a cold Christmas Eve when I experienced something that forever changed my view of the holiday season. As a man who had always loved the festive spirit, that night turned my world upside down, making me question the reality I had always known. The evening started ordinarily enough. My family and I had gathered at our ancestral home, a quaint yet imposing structure that had been in our family for generations. The house, with its creaky floorboards and ancient walls, always had a character of its own. But that night, it felt different, almost as if it was alive, watching us. After a hearty dinner, everyone settled in the living room, sharing stories and enjoying the warmth of the fireplace. That's when I decided to explore the attic, a place I hadn't visited since I was a boy. As a child, I was always intrigued by the attic with its old trunks and dusty books. It was like stepping into a different world, a world that belonged to the past. Armed with a flashlight, I ascended the creaky stairs. The attic was cold and dimly lit, with moonlight seeping through the small window. I rummaged through old boxes, finding trinkets and photographs, remnants of a bygone era. That's when I stumbled upon an old diary. It was leather-bound and worn out, clearly belonging to someone from many generations ago. Curiosity piqued. I began to read. The diary belonged to a distant relative, a young boy who lived in the house during the 1800s. His entries were typical at first, filled with accounts of daily life. But as I continued reading, the tone shifted. The entries became more frantic, filled with fear and paranoia. He wrote about seeing shadows in the house, hearing whispers in the dead of night, and feeling a presence that he couldn't explain. The most chilling part was his final entry, dated on Christmas Eve. He wrote about an entity, a dark figure that roamed the house, its presence strongest on Christmas Eve. He feared for his life, certain that the entity was after him. A chill ran down my spine. The room suddenly felt colder, and I could sense a shift in the atmosphere. The feeling of being watched, which I had initially brushed off as paranoia, intensified. I heard a faint whisper, almost like a hiss, that seemed to come from the shadows. Panicked, I rushed downstairs, the diary clutched tightly in my hand. I needed to be with my family, in the safety and warmth of their presence. But as I entered the living room, I was met with a sight that stopped me in my tracks. The room was empty. The fire in the fireplace had been extinguished, and the festive decorations seemed to mock me with their cheerfulness. It was as if my family had vanished into thin air. I called out, but there was no response, only the eerie silence of the house. Frantically, I searched the house, but there was no sign of anyone. It was then that I heard it. A low, guttural growl coming from the living room. Heart pounding, I slowly made my way back. The sight that awaited me was something out of a nightmare. In the dim light, I saw a figure, dark and shadowy, with glowing red eyes. It was the entity from the diary, real and terrifyingly present. I couldn't move, frozen in fear, as it advanced towards me. The air around it seemed to distort, and a sense of dread filled the room. Just as it reached out, I heard my name being called. It was my brother's voice, distant yet clear. The sound snapped me out of my trance, and I ran towards the voice, away from the entity. I found my family outside, worried and confused. They told me they had been searching for me, that I had been missing for hours. I shared my experience, showing them the diary. We decided to leave the house that very night. unwilling to spend another moment in its sinister presence. As we drove away, I looked back at the house, its windows dark and foreboding. I knew then that the horror I had experienced was real, a malevolent presence that had lurked in the house for centuries. That Christmas Eve changed everything. We never returned to the house, eventually selling it to a distant relative unaware of its dark past. The diary I kept as a reminder of the night when the veil between our world and something far more sinister was lifted. Even now, years later, the memory of that night haunts me. I can still feel the cold dread, the sense of an unseen horror lurking in the shadows. It serves as a reminder that sometimes the scariest stories are the ones that are true, hidden in the pages of a forgotten diary, waiting to be discovered. As a boy, Christmas always brought a sense of magic and wonder to our small town. But one year, that magic turned into something far more sinister, something that still haunts me to this day. I was 12 then, and the memory of that Christmas Eve is etched in my mind like a chilling frost on a window pane. It started as a typical Christmas Eve. Snow blanketed our town, creating a serene landscape of white. Our family had just finished decorating the Christmas tree, and the smell of pine mixed with the aroma of baking cookies filled the air. My younger sister, Lily, was bustling around the house in excitement, talking about Santa's impending visit. "Make sure you're asleep before he comes," I teased her, feeling too old to believe in Santa Claus. She stuck her tongue out at me and scampered off to bed. That night, as the clock struck midnight, a sense of unease crept over me. I couldn't sleep, tossing and turning in my bed. Deciding to get a glass of water, I quietly tiptoed downstairs, careful not to wake my parents. The house was silent, save for the occasional creak of the old wooden floor. As I passed the living room, a movement outside the window caught my eye. I froze, my heart pounding in my chest. There, in the moonlit snow, was a shadow. A tall, thin shadow that didn't belong to any tree or post. Curiosity overcame my fear, and I edged closer to the window. The shadow moved again, and this time I could make out more details. It was a man, or something that resembled a man, but his movements were jerky, unnatural. He was looking right at our house, or so it seemed. A cold shiver ran down my spine. I wanted to look away, to run back to my room, but I couldn't. The figure began to move towards our house, each step deliberate and slow. I could hear my own heartbeat, loud in the silence. Then, the unthinkable happened. The figure stopped and looked up directly where I was standing. Our eyes met, and I saw his face, or the lack of it. There was nothing where his face should have been, just a blank, eerie void. I stumbled back, gasping for breath. The figure raised a hand and pointed at me, a gesture that felt like a curse. I ran upstairs, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I burst into my parents' room, waking them with my panicked cries. "There's someone outside!" I exclaimed, my voice trembling. My father, groggy and confused, got up to check. He returned minutes later, assuring me there was no one there. "It's just your imagination," he said. But I knew what I saw. The rest of the night was a blur. I stayed in my parents' room, unable to sleep, jumping at every sound. The next morning, Christmas Day, was overshadowed by the terror of the night. I was quiet, withdrawn, unable to shake the image of the faceless figure. My parents attributed it to an overactive imagination, but Lily looked at me with wide, knowing eyes. She had heard me get up in the night. Weeks passed, and the fear gradually subsided. But then, something happened that brought it all back. Our neighbor, Mr. Jenkins, an elderly man who lived alone, was found dead in his house. The police said it was a heart attack, but I couldn't help but wonder. Mr. Jenkins' house was directly opposite ours, and his bedroom window faced the spot where I had seen the figure. No one else in town reported seeing anything unusual that night, and eventually, life returned to normal. but I never forgot. Each Christmas Eve, I find myself wide awake, watching the window, half expecting to see that faceless shadow again. Some say it was a trick of the light, a figment of a child's imagination. But I know what I saw, and every Christmas as the snow falls silently outside, I can't help but feel a sense of dread, wondering if the Christmas shadow will return. It was a Christmas unlike any other in our small, snow-draped town. I remember it vividly, for it unfolded in a way that left its chilling imprint on my mind. I was 15 then, eager for the holiday cheer, but what I encountered was far from festive. The day before Christmas, a heavy snowstorm blanketed our town. My parents, busy with preparations, paid little heed to the weather. My excitement, however, was soon overshadowed by an eerie feeling that something was amiss. It started with the whispers in town about a figure seen wandering in the storm, a dark silhouette against the white snow. Curiosity piqued, I ventured out with my dog, Max, into the thickening snow. The town was eerily silent, the usual holiday hustle subdued by the storm. As we trudged through the snow-covered streets, a sense of unease grew within me. The snowflakes swirled around, creating ghostly shapes in the air, and the cold seemed to seep into my bones. Then, I saw it, a shadowy figure, standing motionless by the old oak tree in the park. It was tall, unnaturally so, and cloaked in darkness. Max growled, a low, threatening sound I had never heard from him before. My heart raced, and a cold sweat broke out on my forehead. I wanted to run, but my feet were rooted to the spot. The figure began to move towards us, its steps silent in the snow. I could see no features, just a dark void where a face should be. Max barked furiously, but the figure kept advancing. In a moment of terror, I turned and ran, Max at my heels. I didn't stop running until I reached home. Slamming the door shut, I peered out the window. The street was empty, the figure gone. My parents, noticing my distress, tried to calm me, but their words were drowned out by the pounding of my heart. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every creak and moan of the house set me on edge. I kept thinking about the figure, its purpose, its origin. Was it a trick of the light? A figment of my imagination? Or something else, something sinister? Christmas morning arrived with a bright, clear sky. The events of the previous day seemed like a bad dream in the light of the sun. My family gathered around the Christmas tree, the festive mood restored, but the peace was short-lived. A scream pierced the morning air. It came from Mrs. Jenkins, our neighbor. Rushing outside, we found her in the street, pointing towards the park. There, lying in the snow by the old oak tree, was a figure. It was Mr. Thomas, another neighbor, known for his nightly walks. He lay still, his face frozen in an expression of horror. The police were called, and the town was shaken by the news. Mr. Thomas had died of a heart attack, they said, but I couldn't shake off the feeling that there was more to it. The image of the shadowy figure haunted me, its connection to Mr. Thomas's death a puzzle I couldn't solve. Days passed, and life in our town slowly returned to normal. But I couldn't forget what I had seen. I started researching, digging into the town's history, looking for answers. And then, I found it. Years ago, a man had disappeared during a Christmas snowstorm, never to be seen again. His last known location? The old oak tree in the park. The pieces fell into place, forming a chilling picture. Had I seen the ghost of that lost man, wandering in eternal search of something or someone? I never spoke of my findings, fearing ridicule or disbelief. But every Christmas, as the snow falls, I can't help but glance towards the park, half expecting to see that shadowy figure standing by the old oak tree. And sometimes, just sometimes, I think I do.